My paper was on the analysis of the ASR Hip Implant Failure. Next slide. There were two types of the ASR prosthesis. The ASR XL acetabular system, which was a conventional total hip replacement, and the ASR hip resurfacing system, which consisted of the metal acetabular cup and then the metal cap that you see there, which goes on the head of the femur. So they just leave the entire femur intact. They don't cut off the ball. They just shave down the femur head a little bit and put this cap on top. Next slide. So a little bit of background information. It was first approved in Europe in 2003 and in Australia in 2005. And both types of the prosthesis were approved in these areas of the world. In the US, only the total hip replacement version was approved via the similar equivalence route, which means that because the total hip replacement version was similar to other conventional hip replacements that were currently approved and on the market, it was fine for approval. It didn't need to go through any type of testing or clinical trials. On the other hand, the resurfacing prosthesis was a new type of design that thus required clinical testing, trials, and all that prior to approval. And there were problems in the trial process that the FDA was forcing DePuy to address, and DePuy chose not to address the issues, and consequently the resurfacing prosthesis never came to the market in the US. In total, 93,000 patients were implanted worldwide with the ASR. Problems first began to surface in Australia in 2006. In the Australian Orthopaedic Association National Joint Replacement Registry had a bunch of data they had acquired over several years that indicated an 11.1% revision rate for the resurfacing implant and a 13.6% rate for the total hip version. Which are very high rates. When your success rate is under 90%, that's not a good thing. Consequently, both implants were removed from the market in Australia in 2009, and by August 2010, DePuy issued a global recall. Next slide. So this is a metal-on-metal prosthesis, the ASR, which consists of a cobalt chrome metal femur head and the same type of metal acetabular cup. And it came about as a solution to the problems with metal on polyethylene total hip replacements that were experiencing problems with wear particles. Because the metal is much harder wearing, they thought they could solve these issues. In addition, the metal gives you the ability to manufacture smooth surfaces, which allows for fluid film lubrication. And you can see that in the picture here on the right, that at rest, the metal femur head rests against the cup. While in motion, you get what they call viscous entrainment, where as the head of the femur is moving, it pulls the fluid into the space between the cup and the ball, and the two surfaces are just kind of riding on a layer of fluid, so there's a lot less wear. At least this was their intention for the prosthesis. Next slide. So problems began to arise, and they were getting metal-on-metal contact. Some of the engineering problems that led to this were the shallowness of the cup. And if you look at the picture I have here, and ignore all the text, it doesn't apply to what I'm going to talk about. But if you look at the picture on the left, you have the cup sitting nicely, or the femur head sitting nicely in the cup. About half of the ball of the femur is sitting in there, while in the picture on the right is what they would consider a shallow cup, and only a small portion of the metal ball is sitting within the radius of the cup. And what happens is, because of the shallowness, the ball more easily slides in and out of the cup, and when it slides back into the cup, you get banging against the cup, and you get the metal wear. In addition, because it can move more easily in and out of the cup, it'll rub against the edges of the cup, and you get metal wear that way. So another problem was a need for a perfect alignment of the implant during the surgery. If they didn't get this perfect alignment, the ball would dislocate from the socket, and also the synovial fluid would be compressed out of the joint, and so you wouldn't get that fluid film lubrication that they were looking for. They found that the problems were more prominent in women because of their smaller size. They required smaller cups, and in addition, because of their childbearing nature, their pelvic angles exacerbated the issues with the design problems. Next slide. So what you get with the metal on metal contact is metal wear particles, which you don't want. Cobalt and chromium can be toxic in high concentrations in the blood, but this is rarely the issue with this prosthesis. The real issue is with the high local concentrations adjacent to the implant that can cause metallosis, which is, you can see in this picture on the right, which is quite disgusting. The gray discoloring the tissue, that signifies metallosis. The symptoms include pain, pseudotumors, necrosis, and osteolysis. And the osteolysis is the resorption of the bone, and this can lead to loosening the implant. Next slide. So how are they going to monitor the wear levels to determine if there's a problem? With metal on polyethylene implants, they could easily achieve this through radiography. They could view the depth of the penetration of the femur head into the cup. For metal on metal, this wasn't an option, and they would need to actually surgically expose the joint cavity to measure the metal ion concentrations. And that's not something that they're going to do, just open somebody up to see whether or not they may or may not be having issues with wear. So people looked into measuring the blood serum metal ion levels and then using those to determine the metal ion levels within the joint cavity. Next slide. So one such study consisted of 26 patients with metal on metal hip replacements that were currently scheduled for a revision surgery. And the data they collected was comprised of cobalt and chromium levels in the blood as well as the joint cavity, the presence or absence of metallosis, and then wear measurements of hip components that were going to be removed during the revision surgery. Next slide. So their results, they came up with the serum levels increased. As the serum levels increased, so did the joint fluid levels. And they found an exponential relationship for chromium and a linear relationship for cobalt. The chromium levels in the joint fluid were 50 times higher than in the blood, and the cobalt levels were 40 times higher. They also had they found a linear curve fit for femoral component wear versus the serum metal ion concentration. In addition, for the patients that were exhibiting metallosis, they found the medium serum metal levels were 10 times higher. The joint fluid chromium levels were 28 times higher, and the cobalt levels in the joint were 20 times higher. Also, the femoral component wear was 5 times greater for patients with the metallosis. They were also able to pinpoint numbers where above this concentration level, there was likely to be metallosis present within the patient. And those numbers were 17 micrograms per liter for chromium and 19 micrograms per liter for cobalt. Next slide. So their analysis, they were able to determine that every patient with high serum metal levels had high joint fluid metal levels and higher femoral component wear measurements. So basically they were able to determine that serum metal ion concentration was in fact a valuable diagnostic tool that they could use to measure wear within the joint cavity. Next slide. So one major question that I asked myself was, how did the ASR come to market with all of these major flaws? In Europe and Australia, they only required simulator testing for hip implants. Clinical trials weren't required. Also in the US, you had the similar equivalence route that we talked about earlier, where, you know, if it's similar, it passes, was basically no testing required, which seems a little ridiculous. And, you know, seems like something they need to eliminate. Orthopedic surgeon Stephen Graves was looking into the problems with the ASR and the reasons for the failure. And, you know, he stated that simulator testing was not sufficient to determine if a device will work well within the body, and that you need clinical trials, and they should implant these devices in small groups of people and monitor them for a few years prior to approval of these devices. and they should do this in order to protect the patients as well as the companies from litigation. Next slide. Another study I looked at was to see if more physiologically specific hip simulator testing was needed. Currently, the International Organization for Standardization has a test for the wear of total hip prostheses. And this came about when ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene hip replacements were the predominant player in the market. And these operate under boundary lubrication, whereas the metal-on-metal, as we talked about, operate under, or are supposed to operate under fluid film lubrication. So there's clearly a difference between the two types of hip replacements, and they found that fluid film lubrication is more sensitive to stop-start motion and varying articulating speeds. And so it was clear to them that the current ISO standard was not applicable or not sufficient for metal-on-metal prostheses. Next slide. So in their study, they used patients currently implanted with a hip prosthesis, and they determined they had a mean walking rate of 27 to 32 cycles per minute, which is about a half a hertz. This was opposed to the ISO standard currently of 1 hertz. They found that the patients stopped and started their motion about every 82 cycles, and that in vivo the identical kinetics and kinematics of every cycle that they currently use with the ISO standard was not accurate. And so their more physiologically relevant test included the following numbers: with walking frequency of 0.5 hertz, they were going to stop and start motion every 100 cycles, and they would use 2 different profiles with alternating kinetics and kinematics. Next slide. So some steps that were being taken in the right direction. The Australian Orthopedic Association recommended an upgrade in the classification of hip joint prostheses from Class 2B to Class 3. And this would allow for a greater level of examination and clinical evidence prior to the approval of the devices. Also, the Therapeutic Goods Administration of Australia was and is still working with international regulating agencies to modify the global regulations and get everyone on the same page in agreement that hip implant prostheses need to be upgraded from Class 2B to Class 3. Next slide. Another important question I asked myself is, why did the ASR remain on the market so long? The AOA and JRR gave 17 official warnings to the PI from between 2007 and 2009 that were more or less completely ignored. In Europe, their regulating agency leaves the responsibility with the manufacturer to provide a safe device. So once the device has been approved and it's on the market, they leave the onus up to the manufacturer to decide if it's safe and that there's no problems, and if there are problems, that they're being addressed. And in the past, when there have been problems, they've been afraid to come in and simply ban that product from the market because they're afraid of being sued. So there's a clear issue with the regulatory power. Also, in the U.S., we didn't even have a national joint registry until this year. Early this year, they established it, so it's still a work in progress. And when the ASR, went through its approval and was on the market, we didn't even have a registry here in the United States to pick up issues. However, Australia established the Orthopedic Expert Working Group back in 2007, I believe, in order to advise the Therapeutic Goods Administration whether particular revision rate for a device is acceptable or not. And so subsequently, Australia was the first to recall the ASR back in 2009. Next slide. So in summary, the engineering failures that led to the downfall of the ASR were the shallowness of the acetabular cup, the small size of the cup, and the need for the precise placement of the implant during the surgery, which can be difficult for some less experienced surgeons. These failures led to the engineering failures led to excessive metal wear debris, which caused metallosis. So you had the tissue, muscle damage, and the pain and suffering that was leading to the revision surgeries. In addition, you had a flawed pre-market approval and post-market evaluation system that allowed the approval, the approval of a flawed device and then allowed that flawed device to remain on the market for a number of years and be implanted in patients. Any questions?